Hello there. Thank you for listening to Mike Met's podcast. My name is Mike Bishota, and a happy Thursday to you. Before we go any further, I just want to say if you want to support this channel, please follow us on Spotify or Anchor. The podcast name is Mike's Met's Podcast on both channels. You can also follow us on YouTube, the channel name being once again Mike's Met's Podcast. If you were so inclined, please comment, like, and subscribe on that YouTube channel. And finally, please follow me on Twitter at Mike's Mets Pod, all one word. And if you were so inclined as well to like any of the posts I might be putting up on Twitter, I'd greatly appreciate it. Okay, so today's episode, we're going to be talking about any possible contract extension predictions that I would like to make about Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil, and what we expect could be the eventual contract values for both of those players. So the first thing I do want to wrap up real quick, and I've certainly spent a lot of time speaking about Carlos Correa, but I just wanted to talk about and kind of put a bookend on the Carlos Correa situation. So I want to know what exactly people think about Carlos Correa, and if they feel that this was a fiasco of the sort of epic proportions that I wasn't really anticipating, because it feels like that, honestly. It was an enormous blow up in everybody's faces, and I can't really decide if I feel like the Mets were the ones that came out of it worse, or was it Scott Boras, or was it Carlos Correa? Carlos Correa certainly didn't come out of it looking great, but could be forgiven for just following the advice of Scott Boras. Like it or not, he is now in Minnesota for the foreseeable future. Scott Boras came out of it in a certain way. I believe Boras is going to be looked at as the guy who can't really be counted on to keep his word at any point, and may have also been very misleading in terms of his facts to various teams that were trying to court Carlos Correa. But other than that, I feel like he was doing a good job in terms of trying to protect his client. However, his client now looks like a guy who can't really make up his mind. And finally, the Mets come out of it looking like guys who are trying to be big game hunters, and they certainly have during this offseason going after big game in the form of Justin Verlander, Kodai Senga, all these premier talents that they were in the process of trying to court and bring over to Flushing. However, as we know now, Carlos Correa will not be part of that group. Instead, we now have a team that is left with third base in a situation of some flux. We have Eduardo Escobar still primed to be the starting third baseman. However, Brett Baty is still going to be in the mix, and for Brett Baty, fantastic news. For Eduardo Escobar, great news as well. He is going to be, I presume, the Mets' third baseman for the time being, but Brett Baty certainly has him in the crosshairs and could overtake him by midseason, maybe even earlier, depending on how well both players get off to their starts. I don't know for sure if Brett Baty is going to be the starting third baseman at any point early on, or if he's even going to make the team in the beginning part of the season. My guess would be that he's going to start the year in AAA, but we'll come around to that when we get to it. But by the end of 2023, I do anticipate Brett Baty being the starting third baseman, or at least a starter in some form for the Mets. And you know what? That could be looked at as in a number of different ways. I certainly think that Brett Baty has a fantastic bat, but there's a lot of questions about how quickly he's going to develop, and if he develops into the type of player that the Mets are hoping he's going to be, or if he's going to just being a standard starting player. Certainly a lot of questions up in the air about him. But we have other things that we want to talk about now. And Carlos Correa, we've certainly spent a lot of time talking about already, so I don't want to put any more thoughts about him other than to Carlos Correa. I think he made an enormous mistake going to Minnesota, a team that is not in contention mode. I've certainly spent a lot of time speaking about Carlos Correa not being the type of player who should be in a market like Minnesota, but he's there now, and he's got to make the best of it. Certainly not great being stuck with your third choice, but he has now made his plans, and he's going to be there for the foreseeable future. So, best wishes to Carlos Correa. We would have loved to have you in Flushing, but that's the way it goes. Sorry about that, Carlos. On to the Mets' plans for Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil, and these are two enormous pieces of the puzzle for the New York Mets, and it is imperative to keep both these guys in Mets uniforms going forward. I don't want to see Pete Alonso playing on another team. I don't want to see Jeff McNeil playing on another team. Keep these guys with the team. We don't need to see them playing on divisional rivals, which feels like it happens every 5 seconds now with the Mets talent that is going to free agency and signing with teams like the Phillies and the Nationals and the Braves. We don't need that anymore. Let's make sure that Pete and Jeff stay in Queens. Now, I've been trying to figure out what exactly is going to be the contract value to sort of predict what exactly is going both these guys are going to be getting. And my estimation is that the Mets are not going to let this go to free agency. They don't want to have other teams throwing in their hat. They've already seen this how this could potentially blow up in their faces with Jacob deGrom and how he bolted from Queens the first chance he got. Don't let it go that far. Don't let it get ugly and let it become like a situation where both players feel like they need to get out of here. I feel like Pete should be a Met for life. Same goes for Jeff McNeil. But trying to figure out where exactly these guys are going to land in terms of their contract values is a little tricky. In particular, Pete Alonso, because Pete, a terrific player. There's no denying that Pete Alonso is a fantastic player. However, his numbers don't really jump off the bat, so to speak, unlike the way he hits pitches off his bat. That's a terrible segue, but moving on, let's talk about how he compares to the rest of the league. And how he compares to the rest of the league is telling because if you look at his WAR for the last few years since he joined the league, since he's become a major league player in 2019, his WAR kind of trailing a little behind. He's not the league leader at WAR for his position, but he falls in a good group that puts him in a contract value that you think, okay, this guy looks like he could be paid a similar amount. So the WAR leader for first baseman since 2019 is, of course, Freddie Freeman, and this is no surprise. Freeman is still the class act for first base. The guy right behind him, another guy who could be viewed as the premier player at his position, as Paul Goldschmidt. Both players have been paid very handsomely per SpotTrack.com. Freddie Freeman make his contract $162 million over 6 years. That is an average annual value of $27 million. And then Paul Goldschmidt, a $130 million contract that is an average annual value of $26 million. And also, remember, he received a $20 million signing bonus as an extra added incentive to signing with the Cardinals when it was this 2020. Freddie Freeman signing in 2022. And both guys were 31 for Goldschmidt, 32 for Freeman. So they were on the other side of 30, but still got paid because they are top tier players. Now, Pete Alonso has made a great deal of, let's say, publicity over time, thanks to what has been viewed as a terrific power bat. And Pete Alonso has himself called himself the top power hitter in baseball at various stages in time. But Alonso, a fantastic power hitter, a guy who can hit home runs at a rate that certainly makes people look and say, okay, yeah, I want to keep that guy on my team, or I want to go get that guy. And Alonso is reaching an age that people are going to look at him and say, okay, he's 28 years old right now. If he hits free agency, and the time frame should be that he's going to be hitting free agency at about 30 years old, then you're going to assume that this guy is going to feel like a must-have for a lot of teams. And again, makes it very imperative that the Mets go out and make sure that he stays in a Met uniform going forward. So what's his contract going to be? Well, it depends. And you have to look at the other guys that he is currently in contention with for the spot as top first baseman. So I mentioned Freddie Freeman, and I mentioned Paul Goldschmidt. I want to mention also now the other player who this is probably going to be looked at as probably a very accurate estimation as to where exactly um, Pete's contract is going to land, and that's going to be Matt Olson. And Matt Olson signed with the Braves in 2022 after he was traded. He signed an extension worth 8 years, $168 million, average annual value of $21 million for the whole contract. And you have to look at where exactly this is. So obviously he's making significantly less than Goldschmidt and Freeman in terms of average annual value, even though his contract is larger in total value, and that's because it's for more years as well. So looking at Pete's age, and Olson, I should mention, signed when he was 27 years old. So Alonso, a little bit older, but he's not as old as Goldschmidt or Freeman when they signed their contracts. So we can guess right there that his contract is going to be somewhere in the 5 to 8 year range. And if I was going to guess, I'm going to say 6 years. And the value of the contract, looking at these guys, and let's say Pete doesn't have quite the talent that Goldschmidt and Freeman is. He's just not. They're exceptional two-way players, fantastic leaders, and former MVPs. And Alonso just doesn't have that resume that they do. He has an excellent resume, which makes me think that he's going to be making more than Matt Olson, who hasn't done nearly as much as Pete has. Pete, a former home run champion, RBI champion, home run derby champion, and certainly has a very high profile. Then because from playing in Queens and doing some spectacular things. And again, everybody loves power hitters, and Pete is a premier power hitter. And you have to always remember that with Pete, that he's going to be looked at first and foremost as that premier power hitter. So looking at his contract, I'm going to guess 6 years, $25 million for the whole contract in terms of average annual value. Sorry, not the whole contract. Average annual value of $25 million for 6 years, which will put him at $150 million, if I'm doing the math correctly, for the whole contract. So 6 years, $150 million, average annual value, $25 million. And it's about what Pete deserves, and I'm going to figure that he's going to sign that contract. It looks really good for him to sign that. Now, there's certainly some guess that Alonso may want to have a contract for the rest of his career. He may offer a 10-year deal, or rather, he may not offer, but maybe his agents may offer a 10-year deal that will keep him well paid no matter what the situation is. And Pete doesn't have any kind of health issues. He's stayed healthy his entire career for the most part. And without any major problems that may eventually occur with Pete, we can guess that he's going to remain healthy. But if he wants a major commitment, let's say a 10-year deal, something similar in the vein to what Joey Votto had signed for back in 2014 when he signed a 10-year deal with the Reds for $225 million. Let's say Pete wants to sign a 10-year deal, and let's make it 10 years, $250 million. He stays a Met for life, and he's in place for the foreseeable future. They never have to worry about first base ever again with Pete Alonso. It certainly makes sense, and I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. There's the fact that Alonso is such a highly coveted player that there are some teams that may want to look at him, even if that contract with the Mets is ending when he's about 36, maybe 37 years old, and some teams will probably inquire about him at that point. There's no reason not to look at. I mean, you can look at Nelson Cruz, a guy who's in his 40s now, has certainly seen his best years go by, but teams are still looking into him, and they see him as a guy who is worth taking a shot on because he does one thing, but he does it really well, and he hits home runs, and that's what Pete is. He's a fantastic power hitter. He's displayed, especially in the last year, that he can do a little bit more in power hit. He can hit in situations. He can come up with the key single. He's not just swinging for the fences every time he goes out. So he can do different things, but he is first and foremost a power hitter. He's a cleanup guy, a guy you want in the middle of your lineup, and those guys get paid, and he will get paid, and I think he should get paid a good amount and what he's worth. And I'm going to guess still 6 years, $150 million contract for Pete Alonso. Now we got to talk about Jeff McNeil. And Jeff McNeil is going to be in a situation that's probably even harder to kind of figure out because McNeil is not Pete Alonso. He is not the top power hitting first baseman in baseball, and that's what Pete is. However, Jeff McNeil might be the smoothest hitting second baseman in baseball. And second base, it's kind of hard. It's kind of wrong to pigeonhole Jeff McNeil into just being a second base. But as we just saw, MLB.com released their rankings of MLB.com or MLB Network released their rankings of top second baseman in baseball, and they put Jeff where he belongs, which is number 2, and he is the one of the elite players at his position. He has proved that. If you look at his WAR since 2018 when he debuted, he has a 16.1 WAR that puts him third among all eligible second basemen, just behind Jose Altuve and Marcus Semien. And that puts him in a great situation. Altuve, of course, still being the premier player at that position. There's no doubt. And Altuve deserved his contract, what he got, which was 7 years, $163.5 million, which is an average annual value of 23.3 and some change. But came out of it looking great, and they signed him when he was 27 years old. It's a contract that's aged pretty nicely, even with Altuve's bat slowing down somewhat over these years, but he's looked at pretty good. Semien, on the other hand, a guy who kind of emerged very belatedly. He was always looked at as a guy who had potential, but then from 2019 to 2022 has been one of the top players at his position, and not just as a offensive player, but as a defensive player, the Gold Glove winner. Finished third in MVP voting in 2021 with the Toronto Blue Jays, and splitting that time with Oakland, Toronto, and Texas has been a standout player. Now, his last year with Texas, notwithstanding, which was sort of a mediocre season in my estimation, but Semien still is a fantastic hitter. He is a guy who has been paid very nicely. At age 31, he signed a 7-year contract worth $175 million. That's $25 million a year. So he got paid, and he got paid very nicely. Came out of that looking like a real star, and he is a star. And you have to look at McNeil and Semien and look at how exactly these guys compare to each other. And there's no question that Semien has fantastic power. He's also proved himself extremely durable. He's played in 162 games every year, including 2022 when he played in 161 games. He's maintained an exceptional durability. It's one of the things that people do look at and say, this guy doesn't get hurt. He plays every day. He stays in there, and it comes off looking really good. The same can be said for McNeil, though. McNeil is also a guy who fights incredibly hard. You can't say the same thing that he's never gotten hurt, of course, but Jeff McNeil has played exceptionally since he arrived with the Mets in 2018. Came up with really no expectations, and he's turned into a spectacular player, batting over 300 for the 5 seasons that he's been playing in New York. And of course, last year winning the batting title, a well-deserved batting title, I might add, where he made his second All-Star team, won a Silver Slugger for the first time, and was looked at as a star. And it was a fantastic bounce-back season from 2021, where he was completely out of his depth in terms of how he looked. He was off, and he was like everybody else on that team that year, just really off in terms of his timing, and couldn't get consistent, and it led to a really bad year, and only played in 120 games. He upped that in 2022, 148 games, so not playing every day, but still playing really good, and was game in and game out. He never seemed to be slumping at any point. I mean, he finishes with a 326 average. It's not like he batted 400, but I saw so many games. I was watching so many games on TV, or I went to go see him play in person, and he never seemed to slump. He always seemed to be going like 1 for 4 or 1 for 5, even on those slow days when that's all he was getting, like one hit. He would come back the next day and just like rip out like 3 or 4 base hits in a game, and it looked really great for him. And I've really enjoyed watching him in the last season. Now, how exactly is he going to be paid? Well, that's the question. So my anticipated contract value for him is, we've talked about Marcus Semien, Jose Altuve, and how they got paid. I want to talk about someone else, and that's DJ LeMahieu. And DJ LeMahieu had signed a contract worth $90 million for 6 years back in 2021. It hasn't really worked out that great for LeMahieu. Some people may argue it. I think LeMahieu is a good player, but it's a contract that they were expecting, I think, a little bit more from LeMahieu after he won a batting title in that abbreviated 2020 season. Since then, he hasn't been hitting quite as well as he had the previous 2 seasons in New York with the New York Yankees. And you can really point that to a couple of other reasons. I'm not going to go into anything involving DJ LeMahieu. I want to talk about Jeff McNeil. But LeMahieu, a similar player to McNeil, LeMahieu, a career 297 hitter, and that's counting the last 2 seasons where he's batted 268 and 261. So when he was coming into his contract, the season before he signed his extension, remember, he was a career 305 hitter and had a 787 career OPS. And you're like, okay, like, what does that mean exactly? Well, Jeff McNeil, let's remember those numbers. McNeil, career 307 hitter, career 827 OPS. Pretty similar, and they are similar players. The only difference I would say being that McNeil has kind of settled back into a less power hitting mode, and he's focused much more on just making contact and getting his base hits. And that's been very important. And McNeil we saw fantastic results when he was going with that approach last year. So I wholeheartedly support that kind of play again. DJ LeMahieu, a little bit different, a guy who can hit for a little bit more power, not too much more power, but a guy who can be counted for more comfortably to land in double-digit home runs. Now, McNeil is going to find himself, I think, in a area that's going to be similar to this contract, because McNeil's not young either. Let's remember, Jeff McNeil is already 30 years old. He's going to turn 31 shortly after the season starts. This will be, and then he'll have one more year, so he'll be 32 at the start of his contract year, or the year before he hits free agency. So he'll be 32 years old going into free agency by that point. So let's take that as an estimation. So DJ LeMahieu was also 32 years old when he signed his contract. He signed a 6-year deal, again worth $90 million. Marcus Semien signed a 7-year contract when he was 31, and this was a year after that. So working with that as sort of a baseline, let's assume that McNeil's going to find a contract somewhere in the middle portion of that. If I was going to guess, I'm going to guess 6 years, $120 million for McNeil. Now, it could be more than that. And given the large contracts that were given out to players that really aren't anywhere near Jeff McNeil's stature, it's certainly possible that McNeil will sign for more money. I'm going to say max probably is going to be going for somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 million. And the Mets may talk him down to somewhere more comfortably, maybe 5 years, $125 million. I'm going to say 6 years, $120 million. It pays him $20 million a year. He puts him in a elite class. There's really nobody who's going to be paid like that for some time. And he'll be paid what he's worth, which is he deserves to be paid $20 million a year. It seems pretty strange to think of Jeff McNeil in that kind of large money area, but he really does deserve it. He's been a spectacular player for the Mets since he arrived. He's done everything that they've asked him to do, including changing positions at times, and it's come off really well for him. He's looked now as one of the top contact hitters in baseball, a guy who is a 2-time All-Star. So he certainly has the recognition from the rest of the league that he is a top-tier player at his position, and he deserves to be paid like one. And I'm still going to say 6 years, $120 million as my guesstimate for what Jeff McNeil's contract extension will eventually be. Will it end up being anywhere close to that? Will Pete's be anywhere close to that? Time will tell. I certainly hope it will be, but it's up for the Mets to Before we end tonight, I just want to talk about the release schedule for the podcast. So, my work got very busy, and I do apologize that I made a release schedule, which was it's going to be released every Tuesday. I was going to do a podcast episode that would be released every Tuesday, and I was not able to hold up to it. Just things got very tight in terms of time due to my work, and I don't want to work like that. I don't feel it's a good idea to just keep pushing off time, and this was really the first chance I got, given how crazy my work is, to actually sit down and record a podcast. So I'm doing this after working a full shift. So I have my job. So I'm pretty tired. I've been talking for a while, and I'm going to try and keep it on a schedule release that's going to be more like Sunday or possibly Monday, because then I have the weekend to record these podcasts, to talk and get everything out that I need to get out. So we're going to, for now, work on the assumption that the release schedule is going to be every Sunday going forward. This might change. I'm intending it to be Sunday that I release each episode. But if there's been any kind of change, I will post it on my Twitter, but for now, we're going to shoot for Sunday releases, except for today, which is going to be Thursday. So we're going to be pushing this out on Thursday. Then there won't be a release this Sunday, but the following Sunday will be the release date. And that should work nicely because that's about when my crazy period is going to stop for work. So hopefully that will be the case going forward, and I intend it to be, and I don't want to keep pushing stuff down the line just because it's getting crazy at work, but it really necessitated it. So I do apologize that I didn't stay on my schedule, but I'm going to endeavor to stay on a schedule going forward. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate all the people who have liked and followed my podcast, and I'm still loving seeing any kind of views that are appearing on what I see appearing on Spotify and Anchor and my YouTube channel. So please check those out if you haven't already. And I really do appreciate any and all support that I've been getting. So thanks you again, everybody. Let's go Mets, and let's hope that both these guys get signed real soon. Thank you.